Falenderei cei ormă vă prezentări cu Sabine Roz, Zonia Indira van Klooster, dat pronouncing. Cele asta televiduse le redactore e magazinus o vie arhitectură, pošto Zeta što a potom písal výprav, který má trošku nachapit. Vojačka se na prezentoj dotiet me është gjendja e arkitekturës së përkushtuar në Evropë. Realisht realizuar 36 biroë se cilat do të duhet ishin distribuese për zërat e tashme të arkitekturës. So, to after Indira, the floor is yours. Kept another very more to one veteran team that I agree.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you very much to the Dutch Embassy who made it possible for me to be here. I'm going to try and define it as architecture in Europe and then committed architecture in Europe, that's it. This will become more clear later on. As we have a limited time, I'll try and be quick, but if it's around, let's say, 7:30, then give me a sign. Because we're talking about this. The movie you just saw, so there's a short movie, was there to illustrate that we do share in Europe a cultural context. The images you saw were actually a compilation of these kind of images, and they have been combined by young architects from all over Europe. And we actually understand these architectural references, and we get our architectural inspiration from more or less the same sources in art, in architecture, and philosophy and stuff. So I think it's important to first establish that there is a sort of a shared culture and a shared context, which makes it possible for us to understand images like these within a fraction of seconds, or to understand the political connotations of an image like this, or of this one. And at the same time, you could say that there are quite a lot of differences between the various European countries as well. And this has been beautifully illustrated by Janko Svetkov. I don't know if you know the guy, but he is an anthropologist, and he has researched prejudices all over Europe in maps like these. So you can find in a map like this all the prejudices that the Swiss have against all the other countries. And you can see that, for example, in this map, how the Swiss are preoccupied with where the money goes, where the real estate is, where to go on holiday, and also that they're quite focused on, let's say, Europe, as Africa could be just as well at Mars or Jupiter, and as Korea and China and Japan are quite close by. And the same thing could be said about the Turks, where you can see all sorts of historical references and all sorts of crutches they have. For example, you look at the Netherlands, it says fake tulips, which is of course because tulips are originally from Turkey, and they still can't bear the fact that the Dutch are getting away with it and taking the fame for it. So you can see all these different references which kind of define how we look upon each other as countries. The Russians is also interesting because of, for example, football connotations. And if you look, for example, at the Greek map, it's interesting to see how they connect Ireland to Cyprus, which at the same time had this total financial breakdown of the banking system. So within this, let's say, context of similarities and differences, we tried to establish, I think 2 or 3 years back, 2016, only 1 year back, 1.5 year back, to find, let's say, kind of a leveled collection of established architectural offices throughout Europe that are not like us, we usually focus on beginners, let's say, or on young offices, but more the established ones that still are a source of inspiration to the younger generations and are developing new things. So I think it's important not to focus on the star architects, which kind of reduce architecture to renderings, and we do not actually really care if it gets realized or not, or how it gets built or not. It's just these images going around globally. It could be anywhere. And it's not about, let's say, the more neutral or less ambitious, let's say, the middle of the road kind of office architecture. But we're looking for, well, that's what I would call committed architecture, which is which actually reflects on local contexts or on specific craftsmanship or stuff like that. So this artist studio, Rindhof, is actually a very good example of what we call committed architecture. Or as recently published on the ATAM website, this project covered by Vilka, who is also here, our Kosovo correspondent in Europe for ATAM. So that type of architecture, so where can you find it? I think first we need to have a little bit of an idea of what exactly is Europe, based on data, on figures. Because the ACE, the European Council of Architecture, does a survey every 2 years, and then it goes out to all the architects in Europe, and they come up with recent data. So we have now, on 743 million people, we have 600,000 architects, of which the most are actually based in, let's say, Southern Europe, in Greece, Portugal, Italy. And Romania is the country with the least architects on, let's say, per capita. And it's also interesting to note that 38% of all architects is female and the rest is male. Whereas, for example, in Croatia, Finland, Bulgaria and Slovenia, the majority of architects are actually female. And then, even though we have all these exchanges of architecture and all these references to architecture in other countries, it's actually 4% of all commissions by architects that are done abroad. And from this 4%, it's about 33% that is actually cross-border, so it's in a neighboring country. So even though we pretend to be this big, busy network of experience going all the way, the actual amount of commissions in other countries is quite low. And then quite a new development, which is really interesting, that only 40% of all architecture commissions about new built buildings, whereas 60% is about transformations. And this, I think, we will see later on in the presentation. Of course, we also see it in everyday life. Then, maybe another thing to be aware of is that most of all architectural commissions in Europe are about private housing and other kinds of housing, and that only and then offices, and that the public commissioners, which is cultural, public space, and social houses, is only 8% of all commissions. So. Where we used to think of European architecture as architecture that reflects on the cultural, on the public, we need to readjust this idea of European architecture. So I'd like to find out, to dwell a little bit more on what exactly can we call committed European architecture. And even there you can argue, is it committed architecture in Europe or is it committed European architecture? Well, I tend to focus on the European architecture variety, because we still look for the common denominators and not so much as for a collection of buildings that are by accident in Europe. So just looking at a few examples of what could be a sort of example of European architecture in a committed way. This is our political system for Europe, and where else to start with looking for European architecture than to see what the house of our President of the European Union actually lives in, which is of course not his private house, but it's his office. And this is the office buildings of the European Council, and finished 2 years ago. And what I find interesting about this building is that it has two facades that have windows from all the 28 European countries, reused. So it is symbolic in two ways. It kind of dwells upon the idea of Europe as one being, all these countries contributing, let's say, to the house of the President of Europe, and also to make a statement on the importance of transformation and reuse instead of newly build fabrications. At the same time, this building cost 350 million euros, and the selection process was not all that transparent. So this is one of the images of what we could call European architecture. And this is a close-up of the facade. And this is another. This is a mountain cabin in Switzerland, and it used to be a 16th century stable for cows. And it was recently bought by a collaborative of a Dutch, a Swiss and a Japanese architect. And together they started to refurbish this monument, actually, with a kind of a rural agricultural monument, into a mountain lodge where musicians meet, where you can stay. And they, to preserve it, they tried all sorts of local techniques with clay and wood constructions and wood connections to kind of preserve the image that it used to have, and at the same time make it viable for today's use. So on the left you have the stable as it was, and on the right how it is now. And the Japanese influences are Japanese architecture is very minimalistic and very effective, but most prominent, let's say, in the sleeping cabins downstairs. You have these mountain cabins where everybody sleeps next to each other just to stay the night and then go on. But here you see kind of Japanese tatami style, Swiss mountains, which is this fascinating mix of cultures, which is also European. And another example could be this project, as you probably all know. Two Spanish architects have won the competition for this Philharmonic in Poland. It received the Mies van der Rohe award last year. And it's interesting to see how they approached the brief, let's say. Because if you need this cultural statement, and it has become a cultural statement, but it's also, let's say, kind of a, you can do it in two ways. It could be, let's say, kind of a shiny diamond that's kind of taking this whole village into the next phase, but it's also this kind of alien object that's just landed there in the middle, and it has all these architectural aspirations and all these ambitions that kind of glow from this building. And then in the interior you have this kind of global cultural interiors, as you can see in practically any museum. So it has lots of twisted or ambiguous features in it. So what I wanted to know is, if you would look at, let's say, how architecture has developed in the last time, the last 25 years, and then the commissions that young architects got, what actually has changed and maybe even why. So I started with a Dutch example, and because of the time is limited, I will only take this example, but there are examples of this in every European country. It's interesting to see that this bridge, it was built in 1990. It was the first commission of Ben van Bergen of Huling Studio. They got to build this bridge. And now, if you have, if you're a young architect and you build a bridge, you build this one. Maybe you know this as well. It's a Luchtsingel in Rotterdam by Swiss architects. It's that bridge over there. It's totally unambiguous. It's modest. It's cheap. And at the same time, it brought them the same fame, and it was the same sort of total new statement that made them visible as architects. The same could apply to office space, for example. Because this is your typical 1990s office space in the Netherlands. And nowadays, it could be like this. This is a site in Amsterdam which is made up of used houseboats. And they are being refurbished into circular metabolist office spaces. And at the same time, they are purifying the soil on which they build. So you have all these different approaches which are just as important as a statement on contemporary office space as the other one was 25 years ago. Same could apply for, let's say, serial housing, which is of course what made the Dutch famous. But today it might be collective houses, or it might be 3D printed facade elements, or it might be like this architect, Mark Köhler, who is quite famous by now in the Netherlands. But he's also the face of a Vodafone advertiser series. And it's about how people can adjust their own floor plans just by a set of rules. So you still have these, let's say, these architecture-like buildings, which probably will never change. But at the same time, you see more and more these transformation-like projects, all from very young architects, and it can be reused, it can be bottom-up development, it can be experimental. So it has all these different elements to it, totally different than, let's say, 25 years ago. So, and I couldn't resist to put this picture here, having arrived yesterday in Christina, which, to look at post-crisis architecture almost anywhere in Europe, is that there is this rising interest in collectivity, in sustainability, and in flexibility, also combined with a sense of commitment and a sense of commerce and a certain pragmatism. And of course, this picture doesn't apply at all to what I'm saying now, but what I like is that here you have an advertisement of illegal architecture, which is a Brazilian architecture office. I looked them up later. So it's a very effective way of making yourself heard. I researched the phenomenon of all these small architecture offices in the Netherlands in a book called Reactivate, and to see how actually they work as architects now and how they expand the profession. I won't go too deep into that now, but important is the total differences in how people collaborate, on how there is not one star architect leading the whole office, but all these equals making new architecture, how it's about just starting somewhere and doing something, show something and not just talking about it. So it has all these totally different vibes in architecture. And of course, when looking over this period of 25 years, I will not go into it now, but you have all these, let's say, world-changing events in Europe or outside Europe, which made us reflect on what it actually means to be free, to be creative, to reuse, to deal with the ICT crisis, or to find new connections between sustainability, economy, and community. And then, of course, when everything went wrong, then you have a total new mindset that means a total new type of architecture, a total new approach to architecture. So in these 15 minutes that I've been talking now, we have collected more or less all these types of words. So about values, about how capitalism has changed its color over time, various times, how validation becomes maybe more important than wealth, how you have to find the link between globalization and sustainability, how maybe you could look for quality instead of quantity, all that sort of thing. Which led Peter Buchanan, the editor-in-chief of the Architecture Review, to start a whole series of thoughts on how we could refine the most fundamental purpose of architecture to suit our times. Which is exactly what I try to do with the Reactivate book. So I interviewed all sorts of architects in groups, and I asked them, what kind of things do you think will go quite quickly, soon, and which kind of new words or ways of doing will come back for that. So obviously everything that they expect to be determined quite soon, or terminated. And on is of course what they expect to become more important in the coming years. Now this is only about do-it-yourself architecture, so pretty much simple and small scale, but the words become much more complicated when it's about transformation and reuse. You can also see that the more experimental the subject becomes, the more words they will need it to try and define what exactly is this change. So if we talk about circularity, here you can see that they haven't figured it out at all yet. But there's of course more than words than to kind of define a new role as an architect. For example, in Malta, there's a group of young architects that are now trying to set up an architectural policy to improve awareness and to enforce policy on the continuing urban sprawl and the messy urban structure of Malta. And how this could be improved by, for example, building in a higher density. And of course, it's interesting to signal that the Gezi Park protests were started over a piece of public space, whereas which also course, incented the architecture community in Istanbul to be a big part of the process there. So architecture is by now far more than just building. I wanted to try 3 approaches on what this new approach to architecture could be. One of them could be to reactivate, which is actually small-scale, effective, into the now sort of architecture. And I would like to show you just a range of examples all over Europe, because it's happening everywhere. For example, here in Serbia, where this architect can not only make these public benches that also have solar panels to charge your mobile phones, but he's also a fashion designer, as you can see from the sleeves of his shirt. Or in Ireland, where the old English telephone booths are being reused into something that kind of evokes a new sort of community. Or Lithuania, where an area that was supposed to be this 30,000 square meter office blocks, etc., development was cancelled because of the crisis, and now it's one of the most popular kitesurf beaches to be. And all this container city is actually filled with places to sleep, places to eat, little shops for all the gear that you need for kite surfing, and actually creating a whole new vibe, which is really just as effective. Or how you can reactivate vacant buildings, not by totally redesigning them or making them spick and span again, but maybe by just these light extras that make it easier to reuse the building or to find a new purpose for it. Or to find these kind of experimental buildings. This one is in Denmark, where this architect tried to define how long this building could stay here, because he had no permit whatsoever, and he wanted this urban retreat. And as far as I know, it is still there. Or in Portugal, this project, which was about evolving the local communities. It's not these German architects, actually it was a collective of German, Italian, Greek, Portuguese architects, and they came into this small Portuguese town just on the other side of the Tejo in Lisbon, and they actually hired people from the village to man the library and the bike shop and the kitchen and all that stuff. Or about what you can do on education in other countries, or how you can revive cultural and identification issues just by making stages here in Poland, or in Albania, where you can turn a room into a hostel, but also an artist community. And it becomes so successful that you don't have the time to be an architect anymore, so you keep on running this place just because you think it's important. Or in Malta, where you have this high-density building, and you need to find new forms of making houses. So you have all these different small-scale interventions that try to relate to these new realities, let's say. The second one I think is very important, is to organize, to unite. If there is something that characterizes Europe, of architecture in Europe, or architectural networks in Europe, it's the sheer amount of all these initiatives, like the Kosovo Architecture Festival. You have many of them in lots of countries. You have the Erasmus, you have the RGP, you have the Europan, all these different architecture-related networks that actually unite and cooperate. And it's in this context that I would like to say a little bit more about A10, which is of course where Phil and we are from. And it used to be a magazine until last year, but then the publisher went bankrupt, and we tried to redefine how exactly could we sustain this network of architectural journalists all over Europe, and at the same time find a new way, because magazines in print it's just difficult, not as such, but if you want to make it an earning model, it's really difficult. So we try to find a new approach, and as we have no longer any advertisers and publishers, we can actually focus on all sorts of research. We can work as a mediator between clients and journalists. We can, as we have, and you can see it if you look it up online, we have put all the PDFs of previous magazines online, so you can go through them all and see more about what all the points that we have been discussing in the last 10 years. And we have this Eurovision, which is really interesting to, I think, for all of you to have a look at, because because it's about 10-page specials on about 25 countries so far that we have done. So it has all this information on what exactly is architecture in Europe. And then of course we are also part of juries and stuff. And I just took these two out because they represent something bigger, which is that if we talk about architecture in Europe, it's almost always on craftsmanship, on locality, on transformation, and on community. So that's where I started the story and the in practice and the state of architecture in Europe. It is now an exhibition, or it was in February in Italy. But I heard today that it will come actually to Christina in September, maybe October this year, when the Architects Association is doing a conference, and then they will bring this exhibition over to here, which is really interesting because it has these offices, all these 37, that have been selected by the various correspondents from the various countries, and they're all established and really, really professional, interesting offices, but not all of them are as famous, for example, with abroad from their own countries, and some look for fame and just like to work local, and others are world famous and are still part of this collection. So I would advise you all to have a look at it once it comes to Christina later this year. But it also gives us the chance, if we're looking at networks and communities, to do research. This is a research that we're actually kind of finalizing now, and it's about competition culture in Europe. So it's about how many competitions are there, how well are they paid, how big is the chance of them getting realized, how transparent are the selection procedures, all that kind of questions. And the red arrow is where Kosovo is, because Kosovo is part of the research. And it also researches on, for example, what sort of topics are the subject of competitions. And it has these individual cards that explain a bit about the culture, if it's transparent, if it's good. That's not a very scientific approach, actually. It's really a journalistic approach. It's based on the opinion of the journalists that we have. And the last example of what kind of pan-European research you can do is this one on utopian communities, which is about people that decide to retract from society and found somewhere an ideal community in which they can live by standards that they find important, which could be about equal democratic values, or about new models, or about social systems and everything. So this research will start later this year, and we'll be back with the results somewhere next year. But it's of course about how you can make the change from the individual to the community, and from the community to the intentions of it, and then of course into how the structure is actually realized. And then the third thing you can say about architecture in Europe is that actually things are improving at the moment. Architects no longer, generally speaking, need to confine themselves to these small-scale temporary projects. They are actually building again. So to research that, my next book was called 40 and Famous. 40 is a bit off the image here, but it's about 10 architects around the age of 40 that are actually doing international work, doing big buildings. So we have Kosovo, for example, here on the left. We have, that's Dali from France. We have Sus from the Netherlands, Julien de Smet from Belgium. This is Ala from Finland, and so on and so on. And there we have the cartoonist, and on the right one was me, and Anders Schaap is always somewhere, so that's why he's also in this cover. But it's interesting to see how, what all these offices have in common, let's say, because it's about, as I said, mostly combination of 2 or 3 or 4 of these, about finding new ways of entrepreneurship, of combining bottom up and reuse, but then try and expand it and make it more permanent, or use the principles behind it, but use it in a different way. I think the Erasmus generation is really coming, to say, of age at the moment. So after all these different exchange projects. You can see now where it actually leads to, and I think that the number of architects working abroad will go up soon in the recent years. So a few examples of this. This is Barosi Weiger, who did wine headquarters in Spain. It was a competition they won, and it was really nice talking to them because they were very explicit on what type of competitions they were actually participating in and why and what they were looking for. So they said, well, we have 3 basic rules. First is, do we like the country? Because if you win the competition, you have to be there a lot, so you need to like the landscape or the food or whatever. Just basic kind of gut feeling, is it a good place to be? Second thing is to have a look at the jury and how the process is being designed. And the third is actually the type of topic that is asked for. And they said we have learned through years that the only thing that we can really win is cultural projects, because for educational projects, for housing projects, it's much more important to have the local context. And for cultural projects, for museums and philharmonics and stuff like that, clients tend to look for something that's a bit out of context, something that can be a bit more brutal, let's say, or kind of different. So, when all these 3 boxes are ticked, then they start doing competitions, and they win about 50% of them. So it's a good model. And Ala from Finland is also interesting because they're around 40 now, and they have an office of 40. And their first edition was a concert hall in Denmark, and this is the last one that they recently won, I think last month, for the airport extension in Helsinki. So there is a way of doing competitions which is different from the Guggenheim Helsinki competitions project, which had a 0.06% chance of winning. And I don't know, I keep forgetting that. It doesn't bring, even if you win this enormous competition with 1,715 entries, and still it doesn't bring you fame. So you need to be selective in where to go. For example, this is a bridge in the Netherlands, which was won by an architect who had never done a bridge before, and now they have developed a type of bridge that actually didn't exist before, which is also a way to experiment and to innovate. Another example, for example, is here in Estonia. Yes, Estonia, Coca architects who have specialized in transformation projects. And not only that, but usually they are part of the financial partners as well, so they actually invest in the projects that they're working. And this also works, for example, this is a museum which used to look like this, and it has been transformed into this green adventure, which is really spectacular. Or a refurbished office space, in which the deal with the client was that they wouldn't get any commission for the design, but they would get a percentage of the revenues, which is of course kind of a risk, but they got better of it, and it has actually been a very successful project for them. One of the other advices that came from the 40 and famous selection was leave Europe. So maybe there are chances outside Europe as well. Of course there are. This is a soil from, it's a Dutch, Japanese, Greece collaboration, and they are doing now universities in America and galleries in South Korea. So there are chances outside Europe as well. But maybe more interesting chances are, this is Chartier d'Ali, which is quite an unknown, quite young office from France, who are in the middle of Paris, have just finished a school, which is not only a school but also a microclimate for bees and birds and all that stuff. And as such, it also serves as a kind of educational environment for, let's say, biology lessons and stuff. And then there is the chance to to be more than just an architect. This is an example of Rotor in Belgium, who have specialized not in building but in demolishing. So they have set up a whole set of rules and system to demolish buildings and kind of categorize and generalize all the products that come from it, so that the building industry can use them as if they were new, which is of course a very vital and interesting aspect of being an architect and of thinking about transformation in architecture and reuse issues. And then of course innovation can also be this thing, which is meant to be housing combined with a kind of an energy generator, which probably will never be built as such. But all the knowledge that is being collected now, because Microsoft is in it, there are all these kind of domestic device companies that are in it, energy companies are in it. So maybe they will never build this. This may always be as this fantastic image, but it does actually result in new knowledge, because you make new alliances and you kind of expand on different expertise and stuff. So it is very effective. And then maybe this project in Plovdiv in Bulgaria, where a group of architects has specialized in making competition regulations, which is the obvious result of them complaining all the time about the bad competition regulations in Bulgaria, and then they decided maybe we can do it ourselves. So now, commissioned by local communities, for example, municipalities, they do quite successful competition systems. And then, as the last thing, and I wasn't sure how to name this, it could be political space, public issue, but it could also be public space to make it a political issue. But the thing, of course, is to connect politics to public spaces. And this is a very interesting example of an architecture office in Austria, SU Architects, and they were commissioned with the building of a center for refugees that had to leave the country. And usually they are put somewhere behind bars or in nicer places, and they wanted to make it a place as human as possible, with private space, with public space, and everything. And it caused a huge debate in Austria, because on the one hand, of course, it's fantastic that you think about these human needs of these refugees that will have to return to the countries that they were trying to flee. But on the other hand, you could also ask, do we actually really need to make this type of building? Should we maybe just should we better concentrate on making sure they can stay instead of making them leave comfortably? Which is of course very, very interesting to think about. And this is the same thing as this rebuild by design competition in New York after Hurricane Katrina came by, and that set up a whole design thing in motion with companies and engineers and landscapers and architects from all over the world to rethink on the design and climate change and how to live with risk and how to change the system as it is now into something that is better to live in, safer to live in, at the same time offer something more than just doing safety regulations and stuff. So it's really interesting. So to close off this talk, we could ask, having seen all this, what actually is committed architecture in Europe? So I put back the four examples that I showed earlier and looked at all the data that I gave you throughout the lecture. So how many men, what sort of topics, what sort of architects, what sort of procedures, what sort of themes and thematic approaches are important. And then I think it's difficult to frame committed European architecture, let's say, one word, but we can say that all the architects that are producing committed architecture have been thinking about several of these questions for quite a long time and have successfully solved them. Thank you very much. So that we
somebody has any question for this last presentation? Well,
I don't want to take anyone's place. Did your study include the architects who have left? I mean, you had that leave category. I personally know about 30 who have left Spain for America.
For America?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they just abandon the office and they leave. I mean, did your study include that? And how many, the talent drain, how many architects have left Europe for greener pastures?
That I didn't check, because so there are data on how many architects within Europe work in other countries. So, for example, Spanish architects working in
Right, they keep
Netherlands
their office
or in
here, but then they
Switzerland.
do a project
Exactly.
elsewhere.
But I don't know about data, but it would be interesting to find out who
Yeah, because
architects have just left for Asia or for America.
yeah, anecdotally, I know, I mean, in Spain, it's been a huge talent drain.
Yeah.
Because they, you know, higher salary, better projects, and then...
Yeah. Yeah, when we did the Eurovision Italy, the 10-page special on Italy, they made a map that kind of showed where all the Italian architects went in Europe. So the image was Italy was totally empty, and then all the other countries you could see where they had started up offices or were part of an office. And so you do see a sort of an architectural diaspora all over Europe as well. But outside, there should be figures about that, I don't know.
Great examples. I love the examples.
another question?
Do you recognize it? Because you're all young architects. There's lots of young architects in the audience. Do you recognize this set of ideas on working as an architect, or the sort of commissions you get, or the sort of projects you do? Is it somehow, does it refer back to your own realities? Just looking at many of you.
Yes.
How? In your case?
Well, you noticed that 0.03% chance of winning competitions? I mean, I don't even bother, because it's just that it's too much energy, too much work to try and win something that such a low. I mean, if you hit it, yeah, you hit the lottery. I mean, did you include anything about tenders? Because they seem more approachable. They seem more.
Well, that's part of the European survey that we're doing now with all the A10 correspondents,
Yeah.
to distinct the tenders from the competitions. But that's actually also a matter of definition, because in many countries competition and tender is just the same thing. So even in terms of the definition, it's difficult to separate them.
I think the EU has a very defined term for tender. I mean, with an amount,
yeah,
a threshold.
Yeah. But then if you look at national figures, for example, in Bulgaria or also in Germany, it's not that clear what is exactly a competition and what is exactly a tender. Because sometimes, especially because you do have competitions which have, let's say, a pre-listed selection of 5, and then you do a sort of a paid design. But so that's a method of working that applies both to tenders and to competitions. So we're figuring that out.
I personally think that the thresholds across Europe are too high.
Yeah.
And they stifle young competition. They stifle innovation.
Yeah.
Because you can't go for it unless you're in a big office.
Yeah. So that's exactly the purpose of this competition, because it's kind of a baseline survey. Because once we have this, let's say, mapped out, then the next step is to make a platform so that all these correspondents can inform young offices or small offices on these competitions below threshold that hardly ever are published behind, let's say, over their own the borders of the country, so abroad. It's usually national information on national platforms, usually only in national language. But our step would be to make sure it's available in English, right on time, so that you can still participate and below the threshold.
Well, I mean, the EU has a platform, but it seems, to me, it seems some countries are more fair than others.
Yeah, but below threshold you don't have to publicize it.
No, but some do.
Some
and,
do,
and,
but
and that's
that's right.
encouraging to me.
Yeah.
You know, I know
Yeah.
like in Malta, even below the threshold, they publish it on TED, or you know, even in Germany. But like in England, maybe it's not. You know.
Not at all. Yeah. Yeah. There's really different per country.
Yeah.
Say there is one set of EU regulations, but that's not.
No, it's not even applied. That would be an interesting topic. The research about that, because that would be very helpful for architects, young architects.
Well, we do have a conference on that at the end of September, and then we will present all the results with all the countries that participated. It's at 17. And there will be a book about it, so